Good morning. Whenever you're watching this, I want to say good morning because I'm recording on Remembrance Day and it's just before 11 o'clock. The moment on this day when in the United Kingdom and in many places around the world, we pause. We pause to remember those who've been killed and affected by war and who continue to be at this time. I've just gathered with some of my congregation as we do each Wednesday morning for a brief time of being together, of some music and some conversation in small groups and together. And we've spent some time this morning reflecting on Remembrance Day, telling personal stories, very moving personal stories out of our own families' stories of what this day means to us. And we paused for our 2-minute silence at the back end of that. Today, I want to just spend a couple of minutes in two little places in the Bible, because they really do shape so much of our understanding as Christians of what it means to be people who take part in a war, in a world where there is war, and how we might do that best, and what that means to me. In Luke's Gospel, towards the end of Luke, in Luke 22, Jesus is talking to his disciples just before he's arrested. And he says to them, literally the day before he's put to death, he says to them, "When I sent you out without a purse or a bag or a sandals, did you lack anything?" And they said, "No, not a thing." But then he says to them in the writer's account, "The one who has a purse must take it, and likewise a bag." And then he says, "And the one who has no sword must sell his cloak and buy one." They said, "Lord, look, here are 2 swords." And he replied, "It is enough." A long time ago in South Africa, I had to make a decision, and that decision was about whether I would be willing to be conscripted into the South African Defence Force, entirely made up of, in terms of competence, young white men who were conscripted straight out of school or shortly after they'd finished education into the army, as part of South Africa defending itself against itself, and against the great communist threat that was coming south through Mozambique and Angola. I had to make a decision. My decision was to refuse to serve. And that decision was based on 2 things. One was that I was quite clear that the South African government at the time was an illegitimate government, and that it was using young men like myself to prop up the illegitimacy of apartheid and of the subjugation of black people, violence against, systemic and overt violence against black people, people who were not white, everybody who was not white, except the Japanese, because they were happy to continue in trade deals with us. So Japanese were given the title of the honorary, a kind of honorary whiteness in the bizarre lunacy of that time. But the other pillar on which I stood, the other leg of, well, pillar sounds too strong. The other leg on which I wobbled as I thought about this, aged 18, 19, 20, was that my growing faith and my understanding of who Jesus was asking me to be and who he had been himself did not give me the space to in following his example, pick up a weapon and take part in war, in violence. Even defense. That didn't become violence. When people read this passage, they quite often think that Jesus is arguing, they use this as an argument for proportionality. You know, that's it's fine for us to have an army that is not overtly aggressive, but we need to have a certain number of people. It is enough really means let's just make sure we've got enough. But when you think about Jesus gathering with 11 men and them saying we've got 2 swords and him saying that'll do, it doesn't really make sense. What also doesn't make sense is that just a bit further on, if we read it that way, a bit further on, when Jesus is arrested, Peter draws one of those swords and cuts off the ears of one of those men who has come as part of the entourage to arrest Jesus. And Jesus says, "No more of this. This must stop." And he touches and heals, in the story, the ear of the man who's been wounded. There are 2 ways of saying it's enough. One of those is, we have sufficient for the purpose. It is enough. There is enough on my plate. There is enough fuel in the car to get us where we want to go. We have sufficient for the purpose. But there's another kind of it is enough, which is something we often say to children, not so much to each other as adults. But we'll say to them, that's enough. That's enough. And it is saying this line of behavior, this line of thinking, this whatever you're expressing, it stops now because it's not appropriate. It's unhelpful. And more than unhelpful, it's actually potentially destructive. This is enough. That's enough. When Jesus goes on later on in the passage to say to Peter, no more of this, no more of this. He is proclaiming himself as God, non-violent. Now, you don't have to agree with me about that, either the way I read the passage or the fact of non-violence. I just know that for me is an important part of who I am. So I don't come to Remembrance Day begrudgingly or with any sense of, that I'm oppositional in any way to what Remembrance Day means, but it is quite telling that we do so much of our remembering looking backwards and so little of it looking forwards. We lament what has been, but it seems somehow some people even seem to say inappropriate for us on this day or around this day to really ask questions about what tomorrow looks like and the day after that and what we're doing to stop needing to remember quite so much, perhaps not ever at all, but quite so much, the violence of war, the consequences of war, the rapidity with which our governments take us to war, the fact of the assumption of war as a necessary evil, or for some necessary good in the world. We do a lot of looking backwards, not a lot of looking forwards. I felt young, I felt edgy, I felt brave, I felt countercultural. I was a little bit of I guess in my naivety as a young man, I thought that my stance against the government was quite heroic. Until two military policemen knocked on my door in Cape Town one early evening, and as I saw them coming up the path, I've never in my life again felt such raw fear, because I was quite sure they were coming to arrest me, as they had arrested a good friend of mine, who was the last person to go on trial in South Africa for refusing conscription, and who spent some time in prison awaiting trial as part of that. I've never been as afraid as I was that day. These are difficult days. Remembrance should be hard for us, and not just because of the lament of the loss, but because of the profound questions that a day like today asks us about our human nature, about our human systems, about our assumptions, about ourselves and about other people, about the way that we tell our stories of war and conflict, about the way that whenever anyone suggests that there could be atrocities committed by the soldiers who are on our side and who are like us and are our neighbors, because violence degrades and dehumanizes everybody in the course of it, affects them, desensitizes them, leaves them with scars and wounds that last and last. Whenever it is suggested that in Northern Ireland or in Iraq or in Afghanistan or anywhere we've been in conflict, that our soldiers may have murdered people who were innocent, they may have committed acts of sexual violence, they may have done things that go against the values that we hold in war, we are outraged. But why not? Every other nation on earth may do the same thing. But when we turn the tables and we ask whether our enemies are capable of that, quite often the answer is a very simple yes. I'm not telling you today what to think or believe. I'm not telling you how to do your remembering. I am simply saying that as a pacifist follower of Jesus, I know that today is as much about the work going forward as it is about the looking backwards. It is as much about asking what needs to change in the way we organize ourselves, but also in the way we think, in the way we reflect, in the way we expect things of those who are the foreigner, the stranger, the neighbor. It is about reflecting on tomorrow, just as much as it is about remembering yesterday. And however today touches you, in your own story, in your family's story, in your faith story perhaps, I hope and pray, and I really mean that for all of us, today is about tomorrow and not just yesterday. And that if it is about tomorrow, tomorrow is not just the assumption that all of the yesterdays we've had have been necessary, even good, and perhaps unavoidable. So bless you. I hope your remembering is as peaceful as possible, and I hope that your heart is as peaceful as possible. And I hope that you are ready to say, in whatever direction it is appropriate, and in a way that might be quite hard for you, because you might stand out from the crowd, that's enough. That's enough. Let's stand for good things, and let's see what comes of that. Bless you. It's Remembrance Day. Let's remember well.